Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this morning's first invited speaker, who is Dr. Christopher Jackson. So Dr. Jackson is an expert in sedimentary basins, and over the last 20 plus years has used a combination of geophysical, borehole, and field methods to create improved three-dimensional models of complex subsurface systems. Following his PhD at the University of Manchester in 2002, he became an exploration research geologist in the Norsk Hydro Research Centre before moving back to the UK in 2004 as a lecturer and then professor at Imperial College London and the University of Manchester. He is now the Director of Sustainable Geosciences at Jacobs Engineering Group. In addition to his impressive scientific CV, Dr. Jackson is also a prolific science communicator, having appeared on television and radio in, for example, BBC's documentary Expedition Volcano, and giving a Royal Institution Christmas lecture in 2020. Dr. Jackson has actively brought attention to the lack of diversity, the presence of structural biases, and racism in academia. In addition to this, he has also been a leading figure in the open science movement and is one of the founders of Earth Archive, which is a preprint service that launched in 2017. And so with that, I would like to welcome you, Dr. Jackson, and thank you very much for coming to speak with us. I don't think I'm alone when I say that I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on whether geology can save the world.
It's always interesting, isn't it, when you as the audience come to see a talk and the talk title's different to what the introduction immediately before you said. And that's because, you know, in the preparation and lead up to this, I actually thought, and looking around this room and having seen those slides, I think what I'm going to talk about today still overlaps with the importance of geology, but it also is really pertinent to think about racial and ethnic diversity as one of the axes of diversity, not simply gender, which, if you noticed, on all of the events up to today, really, gender has been the focus of diversity, and I want to introduce another aspect, which is race and ethnicity. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing collaboratively with a number of people listed on this first slide. Natasha Dowie led a project which was known as the Equator Project. It was funded by NERC, the big science research council in the UK. And a number of different people have contributed to this, and I'll go through this. But before I kind of start getting into this, my talks always come with a health warning. Okay, they always come with a warning, because I think whenever we have talks about EDI, it's important to have what we call positionality. It's important to outline where we're coming from and what our biases are and what our background is, what our lived experiences is, because then everything that comes after that in the talk should be viewed through that lens. So, the who, the what, the where, and the why of all of us. So I'm black, heterosexual, cisgendered, working class by background. I'll talk a bit about my parents in a moment. And I'm first generation university attendee, so I was really pleased to see socioeconomics was raised as one of the axes of diversity, because I think that's really important, and it's one of the things which cuts across race and ethnicity, socioeconomic background. And it also informs how we, in many ways, conduct ourselves in a professional sense. But who am I now? Obviously, by virtue of the fact I went through university, I'm now middle class. Okay, that's maybe a journey that some of you in this room identify with. Full-time employment based at a so-called prestigious university. I put that in quotes because, you know, you can decide for yourself what prestige means. But I'm also associated with Imperial College. So a bit about where I come from. I come from a place called Derby. It's right at the southern bit of the Peak District in the centre of the UK. It's a very industrial, very white city. Out of my class of my year group of 225 students, there was only 6 black children. So you times that by 5, there was about 30 black children amongst a school size of over 1,000 people. This is the house I grew up in. That was my bedroom. Does this work? Yeah, that's my bedroom right there. That's where I sleep when I go back and stay at my mum's still. So it's quite nice. She has decorated since I was there. This is me, and these are genuinely my family. I know I look like the cuckoo in the nest, like these are all tiny and I'm huge, and that's true. This is my brother. He's a postman. So my brother got no qualifications at school at all. He's 4 years older than me, and became a postman. This is my mum from Jamaica. She was a nurse. And this is my dad, who sadly passed away 11 years ago. He was a nurse as well. He came from St. Vincent's, a small island in the Caribbean. My mum and dad came over to the UK in the late 60s as part of the Windrush generation. You may have heard of that. And so they came over to the UK at a time when racism was like literally state-sponsored, right? Whereas, I grew up in a very different environment to them in some ways. But they very much inform me, or inform who I am present day, is my parental background and my brother being a very different person to me. Growing up, I didn't spend a lot of time studying, I'll be honest with you. I was not the most attentive of children. I spent most of my time doing this, running around and kicking a football and representing my county at sports. I was just talking to Sebastian Castletalk there about all of the ways in which I found things to do other than study. And I went to a school as well, which was, how can I put this in English? Crap, I don't know if that word translates. It was a bit rubbish. So I went to an inner city state school in Derby, and it was in the lowest 5% of academic attainment for the whole of the UK. It's called Noel Baker Community School. Despite all that, I got what I needed from that education. I got some qualifications, and I think as well, what I experienced in that upbringing, no matter that journey I went on my second slide through the education, university, middle classes, working at a fancy university, I think I'm still very rooted in that educational experience from when I was 11 to 16 years old. And I think it's important to bring that authenticity and that realism with you from your own personal journey. And that was my school. It was fairly inglorious. So how does a kid with that background end up being interested in these things? Rocks. I often ask this question. There's a prize for whoever can tell me where this is. But I'm in the wrong room. I'm in the wrong country, perhaps. But some of you may have been there. Does anybody know? No. It's a place called Mamtor. It's in the Peak District. It's where the term, or the rock-type turbidites, was actually invented by a guy called Roger Walker and for the UK sector, but it was obviously Dutch workers before that had proposed other names. But this is why. And why would a black kid from a working class background end up being interested in rocks who grew up there? Well, it's because my parents were really weird, right? They were interested in this. My parents were really into caravanning and camping, and I have no idea why. I think it's because we grew up in a relatively poor household, and so the only thing we could afford to do for holidays was to actually go out in a tent or a caravan into the local environment, which happened to be the Peak District. And I think it was that nearness with the natural environment and being around there is what kind of instilled in me an interest in the natural world. I was not particularly interested in science. It was my second worst grade. You'll be saddened to hear, just ahead of French at GCSE, okay? So I was a terrible scientist. I was even worse at French. But by being in the natural environment, that triggered an interest for me in the natural world and therefore the utility of science to answer earth science questions. And I think, again, recognize, because I often get asked, like, Chris, you are here now doing this, how do we replicate your journey to make more black people want to do geosciences, or how do we diversify over geosciences with your story? And I think it's pointless to try and do that. When we talk about diversifying things in any particular way, I think we need to step out of our individual stories and actually understand that our individual stories are just that, they are individual. There is often not a magic bullet that we can apply to other people with their stories, okay? So we need to be a bit more forensic. So I went to the University of Manchester, did an undergraduate degree in geology, did a PhD in the Suez Rift, looking at rift tectonics, and went and worked in Norway for an oil company then called Norsk Hydro, now called Equinor. It went through a million different names between then and now, working onshore and offshore as a research geologist. So, for me it was a very steep trajectory from that schooling experience in Derby through to higher education, and then eventually into the world of work. I then left Norsk Hydro at the time, and moved to Imperial College, where I was for about 16, 17 years, running it's called the Basin's research group. So I won't say group leader, I was kind of corralling the cats, really, but it was a loose collective of people who were interested in basins, And we worked together and we had a really good time trying to understand how the world worked. And then I went back to the University of Manchester for a year, and then that all blew up, as some of you may remember, which I'm happy to talk about in a bit. And now I work for Jacobs. But that was like the kind of my experiences. So why do you need to care about diversity in geosciences? Okay, so given my background and my journey, why is it that I kind of realised the importance of not simply just doing good science is important for geoscience? Why is it important to think about diversity at all? Well, as stated here, some of the biggest challenges we've got currently on our desks and coming in the future require geoscientists, and that's captured here in this post from the GeolSoc, where you can see geoscience is applied to solving a number of different issues: hydrogeology for water provision, seismology, physical volcanology for geohazard prevention or mitigation. We can look at the use of geophysical data for locating important resources, geostorage, geoenergy. So all of these things require us. We are the most important people in the world, geoscientists. But if we're going to make sure our science, as awesome as it is, works across all of the communities we're going to need to engage with, we need to make sure that we are aware of their cultural contexts. We need to make sure that these global problems we have a global language with which to go and talk to people with. And frankly, we don't have that, and I'm going to talk about that now. We can't, and we saw this with COVID, didn't we? It wasn't necessarily that the immunologists and virologists couldn't come up with a cure. It was the fact that our behaviour, psychologically, sociologically, was the harder thing to control. So it's to do with how we communicate science as much as the excellence, quote, I hate that word, of science itself, right? It's about how we operate. But geosciences in particular lacks racial diversity as well as diversity of a number of different types due to systemic issues to do with higher education, but also to do with discipline-specific issues that are exclusive to geosciences. So what's the state of play in the UK? I said there's a problem, now I need to prove it to you with some graphs. But these are nice graphs. Well, they're not nice, they tell a horrible story. But they look nice and they're simple. So you can see here, if we look at black, Asian, minority, ethnic, BAME is a term which is highly debated, but it is the term which is used by the UK census, right? So if you want to benchmark your data amongst your community, you need to take data from some sort of census, and therefore you're kind of committed to using the terms under which those data were collected. So if we look at 18 to 24-year-olds, and they're roughly what we would say with the university attending age group in most countries, it's about 18.5%. Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. If we look at undergraduate education in UK higher education, there's an overrepresentation, if you will. It's almost 25%. But remember, when we're talking about BAME, black, Asian, black and minority ethnic, there are a number of different types of ethnic and racial dimensions in there, isn't there? And I think that's one thing, again, if you leave the room with one thing today, remember that when we're collecting demographic data, you can sometimes mask a range of existing problems by not being detailed enough, because the barriers faced by those different groups are very different. But if we lump them together, they look the same, and therefore we propose one solution to help BAME people, and it doesn't really help. If we go now from undergraduate education as a whole, so that's for all degrees, and we look at physical sciences, of which earth sciences is one of those, we see a significant decrease from 25% to 17%. But again, and that's actually kind of almost on par with the overall BAME representation in the UK. But if we go to geology, it gets worse again. So you can see that slow decline in BAME student representation in higher education as we go down to the discipline that we hold close to our hearts, which is geology, okay, so 10%. What's amazing about those data from the study we did is the only subject which is worse than geology in terms of engagement for BAME students at undergraduate level is veterinary science. So people who look after animals. And then there's us, and then there's loads of other stuff. It's amazing, we're worse than physics, right? I mean, it's kind of incredible. That was kind of one of the surprising statistics. So that's for undergraduate level. What about, where do those students go, okay? And we this is Phil Batty. Some of you have heard of the Times Higher Education. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me routinely shouting about this. So we have this obsession with league tables. You probably have it in Switzerland as well, about we love to rank things and put them in an order. If we look at where those BAME students go, about 4% of them go to these so-called high-tariff universities. In the UK, we call that red brick, or Russell Group's universities. Manchester, Leeds, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial. Relatively low participation. That's 4%, remember, against the overall 25%, remember, for BAME student participation across all degrees. So there's only 4% of those, 4% representation in those fancy universities. If we look at so-called low-tariff universities, that's low tariff is the unfortunate consequence of having the language high tariff, which is the terms used by these ranking tables, right? It's significantly higher, it's 3 times more. Why would BAME students be going to so-called worse universities? Is it because they're less smart? I kind of pose this as a question for the workshop, or are there other issues at play here as to why they go to universities which have lower entrance requirements? Could it be that those universities are in certain parts of the country where it's cheaper to live? Could it be that some, BAME students tend to live within urban centres rather than, so actually they want to stay in cities and there's more choice if you decide to go and study in a city. Therefore, you're more likely to end up in one of these universities. Let's move on then to postgraduate research. So we looked at undergraduate research there, but now we're going to look at PGR, postgraduate research. BAME student participation or representation in that area is about 18%. If we look at physical sciences again, we're going to do the same journey down to geology, and I say down because it's going to be downwards. If we look at physical sciences, we see a significant drop-off again, and then geology comes limping in at around 10%. So we see this attrition, and it was graphs like this that actually was one of the stimulations for the Equator project, which I'm not going to talk to you about today, but it was that recognition that there was again this poor representation for black students, and more broadly than that, racial and ethnic minority students in postgraduate research in geology, that made us want to go and do that project. If we think about why that might be, let's think about funding, okay, because you can't, unless you're absolutely loaded with money, you need funding to do postgraduate research education. I don't know, in Switzerland you might be able to get a loan. But again, think about postgraduate loans. Who can afford to take on a postgraduate loan? You need something behind you. You need financial security, and you need an endowment of some kind. In the UK, a lot of the funding comes to the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI. And if you look at studentships that are awarded to ethnic minority students, and ethnic minorities now is the term that UKRI use compared to BAME for the census. So this is when you're doing these demographic studies, you have to kind of think about how if you're comparing apples and apples, because people report things differently. But it is, in this case, kind of directly comparable. It's about 9%. If we look at NERC, who funded the Equator project, it's about 6%. So 6 out of every 100 students in the physical sciences are from a racial and ethnic minority group, and 94 of them are white. It's kind of amazing, really, that, and this is not for geology, by the way. This is just straight up for NERC funding and UKRI funding more generally. It's pretty bad. And again, if I just take you back to look at the demographics at the UK level for people 18 to 34-year-olds, so the group of people who could access that funding, right? So 18 to 34-year-olds could access this funding or apply for this funding or win this funding competitively through the university, it's about 20%. So again, a gross utter representation or people accessing that funding, I should say. So why is this happening? Well, we think there are a number of different reasons listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just the ones in red that I've highlighted I think are worth a comment. So one is the awarding or attainment gap. So there's a number of studies which have been done to show that if you take a black student and a white student and they have the same A-level grades and they both go in to do the same degree, so you do a number of controls for where they go and study and different things, and same discipline, the black student will get a half a degree classification lower than their white peer, which is enough to take you from a first in the UK language to a 2-1 or a 2-1 to a 2-2, right? So it can take you into a 2-2, and in fact a 2-1 to 2-2 slip would mean that you're going to struggle to access funding for master's or PhD level research. So half a degree classification, which is only 6 percentage points, doesn't sound much, but why would somebody who's coming in with the intellectual firepower of their white peer, why would they be attaining Why would they be attaining less through their undergraduate journey? There are reasons that have been discussed for this by different groups, one of which is that black students are more likely to be working whilst they're at university. Black students are more likely to live at home while studying, and therefore there's a number, anybody who's lived at home with their parents will know all of that about that. Some black people have more caring responsibilities, either provision, and working is one of those things, provision of finances into the family. So there are a number of reasons why that awarding or attainment gap exists, which mean that people who are going in with that intellectual firepower are not fulfilling their potential at university. Application systems that fail to account for these biases, this is something I've written quite a bit about, and I think I'll come on to that later on. We have systems which focus on something which people like to refer to as excellence, which doesn't mean anything really, apart from you know it when you see it, and it's normally a white guy. Right? So we have application systems which say, have you won a prize? Do you have research experience? You know, there are a number of different things that we think are measures of somebody's ability, in this case, to conduct PhD level research, but what they could equally be telling you about is the access to opportunity. I'll use myself as an example here, right? I did not have any research experience before I did my PhD. Why? Because every summer, as an undergraduate, I went home and worked at McDonald's and a box packing factory, right? Because I needed to raise money to go back to university the following year, because my parents were both nurses earning £11,000 a year. Whereas if you have that financial stability, you could then go and work in a lab for somebody, maybe get some money, maybe even work as a free researcher, right, for somebody. And therefore, on your CV, when you come to apply for PhDs and the application criteria are set to measure your attainment with these sorts of things, there isn't enough thought going into how we select people. And I've talked about this not just in terms of PhD selection criteria, but also in terms of how we hire faculty. Of course, right? It's a pervasive problem which goes all the way through, I think, from undergraduate intake all the way through to people being promoted to the highest professorial levels in the institutions. We're not looking at people individually in their stories. We also have this issue of lack of representation at faculty level, this idea of a hostile environment. It's a term stolen from Theresa May's government, the Conservative government a few years ago, but I'll come on to speak about that in a moment. What about geoscience-specific issues? Remember I said earlier there were systemic issues, and they're the ones on the left for you, because they're across all degree programmes, but the ones on the right are more discipline-specific, and therefore you could argue are much more within our control as geoscience staff and students to alter. Rural environments are less accessible to children who grow up largely in urban households. In the UK, at least, I'm sure it's the same in Switzerland, not many black people live in the countryside. Right? And that's certainly true for the UK. Yet, one of the things that's often stated as the reason people go into geosciences is because they have a natural and early formed love of the outdoors. If you don't have access to that, then you are not going to be drawn to that discipline. So there is that kind of issue, and that's because why do black people live in urban environments? It's because there's jobs, right? And the housing's cheaper, typically, apart from in London. Stereotypical white man image, I'll come into that in a moment as well. It's not gone unnoticed in this room. I don't know about you, but I always walk in rooms, I'll be honest, I always walk in rooms and I'll look and see if there's any black people in it. I can't lie and say that doesn't happen. But again, we often find ourselves in very white environments, right? We often find ourselves in very white environments, and I'm 46 years old almost now, so it doesn't bother me. But I think when we enter spaces and we see this on the ceiling, we need to think about what feelings that provokes in us, what that makes us think about, who it makes us think who isn't here. And fieldwork barriers. I'm a field geologist by training. I have a deep-rooted love for standing at the top of the mountain in the rain, looking at rocks. A lot of people don't, and there's a lot of barriers to people who want to do that, so I'll talk about that. Alcohol culture, a bunch of other things. If you Google geologist, this is what you find. A bunch of white dudes with hammers, typically sticking it in zero-age lava, or collecting zero-age lava samples. all outdoors, very ableist. I think as well another thing to take from my talk, hopefully in the whole session today, is this idea of intersectionality. When we talk about barriers to engagement for one particular group, we can often then think about those barriers for other groups in parallel ways as well. But this is like the first thing you see if you Google geologist. What does a geologist do? I mean, I don't know any geologists who do that. Right? I don't know. Maybe you do. But, it's just, when you have and going back to that previous slide, there's ableism, there's this kind of outdoorsism, there's, quite frankly, a lot of this just looks really dull to me, and I'm a geologist. So let's think about some of those barriers. I highlighted them. I said I'd kind of step through them. And this is towards, you made those notes on your pieces of paper about how you would build diverse teams, and then the idea is that you go through this journey today and then think about revising those approaches, and hopefully some of these slides will help make you think about that. So if we think about the numbers, 10% of UK resident geology undergraduates are from BAME backgrounds. I just showed you the graphs for that. But like I said earlier on, a Geological Society of London survey 2 years ago now, 60% of respondents said that they had a lifelong interest in the natural environment. And that goes back to this issue that if you don't have access to that natural environment, then it's less likely that you will be taken at an early age with geology. Even if you're STEM or science interested, why would you get into it? And Joanna Katwa, who was one of the co-PIs on the Equator project, wrote this piece called Black and Brown Faces in Green Spaces. She gives a talk on it, and she wrote a piece for AGU EOS on this, which I recommend. And not everybody has Durdle Door. This is a very spectacular exposure here of Cretaceous carbonates here on the south coast of England. If you want to talk about ableism, like getting down to that beach is a total nightmare. But still, undergraduate field trips try and take students there sometimes, anyway. But this is where I live. This is called Stockport. This is just south of Manchester. And this is a beautiful 280-metre thick exposed Triassic fluvial sequence next to a motorway, the M60. You can't get there because it's really bloody dangerous, right? But across the other side of the valley, in the city of Stockport itself, there's these incredible exposures of rocks, like natural rocks exposed, which they built the city around. And you can take people to those exposures and show them how, teach them about sedimentary facies, teach them about petrology, teach them about how the human landscape is built upon the natural landscape, and start to build that connection between people and their place and the multi-billion-year history of the Earth. We don't have to take people in the first instance when they're younger to these very remote places. We can start to bring the natural environment into urban settings and therefore try and close that gap. And I'm sure out here you have the same. And even if it's not a natural rock outcrop, take somebody to a building stones. You've got amazing building stones in this city, right? Incredible. I was walking around this morning. You can go and talk to people about where those rocks come from. I've done some work on this looking at race and harassment and racism in the field. We wrote a piece here with Josh Anadu and Hendrata Ali here, which was in AGU EOS, and this was looking at racial violence in the field. That's verbal and physical. So I did field work. Josh, the reason I got in touch with Josh is because he basically had somebody pull a gun out on him when he was doing field work in Oklahoma. And this was about 4 months after George Floyd was murdered. So me and Hendrata and Josh, I was sort of not counselling Josh at all, but we were talking about that experience. I've had a gun pulled on me in Colorado doing field work as well. And, think about those barriers. I think often when we think about fieldwork safeties, we are often thinking solely about rocks falling from a cliff, dehydration, scorpions, maybe students being stupid and drunk. Right? But there are specific barriers to engagement, and I'll come on to some of these hidden ones in a moment, that I think when you're doing risk assessments you might not consider. Right? You might not consider the safety of black people versus the safety of white people. You might think they should be no different, right? A rock's a rock, it's going to fall. But there are other things at play. So, what can be done? If we think about BAME students, there's this classic sort of diagram here of, we can broaden participation and improve inclusivity. We can do that by adapting fieldwork experiences, so we can try and make the field safer for different people. We can reform accreditation. What does that mean? In the UK, undergraduate degrees are accredited by the Geological Society of London. That means that they have to contain certain subjects in the curriculum, and one thing they typically had to contain was a lot of field geology. And that's recently been reformed to reduce the amount of field geology as a requirement for various reasons, cost and a number of other reasons, but one thing is that it actually makes you actually then start to realise that field geology has a place, but it's not the only type of geology there is. Right? We need geologists who are trained in other things. Summer schools and paid internships, we have these in the UK now as well. Equator ran a school to modernised teaching. By that I'm talking about things like, you probably have heard a lot about decolonising the curriculum, either in geology or other things. I've not talked about that today, but geology has this, and I've kind of written about it with some friends, and other people have written far more eloquently than me about it, that geology has this very deep-rooted colonial history. You know, geology as a discipline arose for resource provision, largely, right? Around the world in places where, I'll put it mildly, white people historically weren't, okay? And because of that, it has that colonial root to it, and I think the recognition of that root and the discussion about that will not only better culturally enrich us, but also in the future may mean that we guard against some of the same issues in future when we, for example, let's say, start exploring for critical metals, rare earth elements. We don't want to repeat the things that happened when we were looking for fossil fuels. So I think that modernising teaching and educating our students is a hugely valuable thing. And removing structural inequality through processes, you know, removing discriminatory practices, ring-fence funding, and making application forms more transparent. Just to kind of last 5 minutes here, you know, I think representation matters. It's important to have people in positions of visibility so that people can aspire. Bearing in mind that warning I gave at the start of the talk, those people who are visible are unique in themselves, and it's not simply the case that you replicate their journey for everybody. But I think that representation is still useful. We don't have that representation in geosciences in the UK. If we think about BAME professors in the UK higher education, it's about 11% compared to 13% of the non-white population in the UK, so slight underrepresentation. If you look at black professors in the UK, so that's the B of BAME, remember, it's 0.7%. It's not even a whole person on that graph. This has been talked about, it's absolutely horrible. There's 220,000 academics or so in the UK, 2% of them are black. There's 140 of the 21,000 professors are black, right? So that's where the 0.7 comes from. I resigned earlier this year, and a few other black people resigned. So that number's about 118. So it only gets worse. But this goes back to that representation, hostile environments thing, right? There aren't any black professors in geosciences. There's not many black professors, full stop. Black women do, again, intersectionality, black women do particularly badly. I think in black women now, I think it was 25, but I think it's about 32 now, as I understand it. So that's kind of gone up a bit. And why does representation matter? I've been fortunate enough to kind of do some stuff. This was the Christmas lectures, this was Expedition Volcano, doing some presenting, talking about geology, and this was the most fun thing. I did a TV show called The Great British Menu, where they just fed me a 9-course meal. And I don't even know why they asked me to go on that, but it was really good fun. But you get chances to go and do these sorts of things, and you can then use that representation, locally where we lived in London, regionally, nationally, and globally, to go out to people and sort of talk about why geology is really important, and also represent not only geosciences, but also black working class people more broadly. I tried to do that kind of, these are some things that engagements I've had on social media, and then they spiral into actually people sending you things. There's this lovely card that this girl in some small state in the US sent me, having watched Expedition Volcano on PBS in the US, so it was kind of good fun. Another kid made this whole Lego mobile set of a volcano. Do you like that, Alexander? It's kind of nice, isn't it? There's a volcano, and then if you zoom in here, there's me, with a little hand lens and a little laptop with a geode. I got 41% for mineralogy at undergraduate degree, so she obviously didn't hear about that. But, you can sort of inspire people for Black History Month as well. I've been into schools online and talked to people. So when these can't be expectations of the people who are minoritized in geosciences to go and do these sorts of things, but equally, if you are fortunate enough to have some visibility and you feel you have the energy to do so, it's a really empowering way for yourself and for other people to go out and talk to people about both your discipline but also yourself. And that's what I always try and do, as I've done today, is tell people a bit about myself, not just about why geology is amazing. There's always some random Twitter troll who wants to kind of racially abuse you. When I did the Christmas lectures, I was interviewed on Sky, which is one of the big news networks in the UK, and the big story about the Christmas lectures was it's been running for 182 years. For 180 years, there'd never been a black presenter. For 180 years, right? 180. And I was at great pains to talk about climate change and the geological record of climate change. I thought that was important, but everybody wanted to talk to me about being black. And so I thought it was important to do that, right? I thought it was a really good opportunity to basically say, I'm not the first qualified black person in 180 years to have existed, right? And I said that, and they asked me why, and I said it's racism. And then a bunch of people turn up, and you can dismiss this as being, Twitter, people saying horrible things to you, but it's not, because people actually write you letters, and they send you books, and they stop you in the street, and they send you violent direct messages on Instagram, right? So it's not simply that Twitter is this inflammatory thing. People are just racially horrible. And it's amongst us, and it's around your dinner tables, and it's probably amongst some of your friends, and it's hard to admit. You'd like to think it's reserved for social media, but it's not. People here saying that the reason this happened in 2020 is because George Floyd had just been murdered, and therefore they went and found a black guy to present it. Black time, professor in these times of wokeness and virtue signalling, all of the standard slurs. Science isn't racist. And does he look like a scientist without his glasses? That was my favourite one. I just think that one's quite funny. What was kind of odd is, I just want to show this, is that I was actually asked to do the Christmas lectures on the 19th of March, which was before George Floyd was murdered. It was announced in July after he was murdered. So all the people who are undermining your validity as a scientist, and some of the women, no doubt, in the audience here, have either heard or felt the same, people will come for you, right? They will come for you, and there will be angst and anxiety and aggression around your validity and your qualification to be in the position you're in. But they just don't know what they're talking about. So just to wrap up, really, I did the lectures anyway, and it was really good fun. It was I'm still in therapy for how hard it was to do it. But like I said, in the lead up to this, I did do a lot of press, and I tried to talk about the diversity in science as much as I did about the science itself. I'm up for the fight, first black scientist, professor urges organisations to help tackle racism, misogyny and transphobia. And that just got me untold amount of horrible messages, right? Quite frankly. Because people and you can sort of imagine where it comes from. But yeah, just to kind of re-impress upon you, there's this important messaging and re-messaging when we have the forum to do it and to talk about science. And I include EDI as science, right? That's probably what I'm trying to say. White male scientists control the narrative. Yeah, and I was really nervous about giving that lecture, and I'm always really nervous when I give talks like this, because I think you don't want to screw it up, because those opportunities come along quite rarely. So, I was really, really scared when I got asked to do this lecture that people who had said I wasn't valid to do it didn't then have a justification because I didn't make a mess of it. But yeah, tokenism, virtue signaling. But yeah, it's important to talk about every aspect of ourselves. Just kind of final slide, and I talked about this when I came in. If you are a middle-class man who goes to university, gets promoted to professor by the age of 30, whatever, blah, 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 wins money, gets prizes, people will still, a few years ago, just shout at you in the street, okay? And the reason they do that is because the first thing they see when you walk into a room is not necessarily that you're a middle-class educated black man. What they see is a black man, right? Or they see a woman, or they see somebody with obviously some representation about what they're wearing, or their accent, or the way it's something about their hair colour, which is the thing that they focus on. So it doesn't protect you. Races are like, it's, you know, the saying I use is, it's hard to educate yourself out of racism, right? You can't elevate yourself above it in the eyes of a stranger who meets you for the first time. The reason I show this logo, some of you will know which university this logo is from, some of you won't, so the university will remain unnamed for now. But I went over a couple of years ago to give a talk, and it was an invited talk, and they flew me across, they paid for it, and I had some FaceTime with the dean of the faculty. And I was dressed like this, and I walked into the room, and he was a bit busy, and he kind of sat me down, and he said, "Oh, sorry, hi, yes, Chris Jackson, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you here about the PhD?" And I went, "No, I'm not." And he said, "You hear about the PhD position?" I said, "No, I'm the invited speaker that is for the colloquium." And he went, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, oh, I'm really sorry." And you could see in his eyes. And for one beautiful moment, I was thinking, I should have just said yes. And then watched his face as 2 hours later I walked on the stage to give the colloquium talk. But, you know, and again, and I think we were talking about this I can't remember who I was talking to about this. The number of times I have walked in to load my talk up at a conference and somebody said, "Are you running the AV?" Or the number of times where I have recently moved house and I went into a local coffee shop and I was looking to buy something and the person behind the counter said, "Are you the food delivery guy?" You know, and like racial microaggressions is the term which you've probably heard of. It's like those sorts of things which are quite amazing, really. But they happen regularly, and I think, you know, it's important to be aware of that. And in many ways, this is kind of good that an educated black person should suffer racism like any black person, because I don't think being educated should mean that you are any more special than anybody else. I'd just like people to be less racist, to be honest, but, you know, as it is, that's where we are. So what's next? I think it's kind of important to carry on thinking deeply and talking to people about this. I think it's important on the right here to think about luck and privilege. All of us have some of that. You know, even me as a black person, I'm a man, and therefore I am not subject to some of the discriminations that are visited upon women or non-binary people, right? So I need to still work with the luck and privilege that I've had, and I'm still doing it because these are my 3 daughters who just terrorize me, as you can see. And I kind of, and you know, the reason I say talk about this is because I regularly talk to them about these things. It sounds a bit heavy for small children, but it's actually really important to tell them about who you are, who they are, what the world is like with you, because I think by informing the next generation, hopefully they'll be better equipped to deal with some of these issues. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you for sharing your personal experiences. It's very valuable for us to be able to hear them. Thank you. We have time, maybe 5 minutes for some questions, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. Yes, Daniela.
So you've been in the receiving end of discrimination, if you want. So what are your 3 recipes to make everybody welcome in your team, and not only the people who look and speak like you?
You want me to do your homework for you on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if you get your pens ready. And what's my recipe? I think I don't know if I'm not sure if there's a recipe really. And maybe I just do some of these things unconsciously, you know. What's the recipe for doing this? I think educating, informing yourself is really important, and it can be practical things like, you know, social events, let's not have alcohol there, and you know, I think there's some really practical or, you know, when we go in the field, we're going to make sure that there's planned toilet stops so that people need to change sanitary protection can go, you know. So I think there's some practical steps which make spaces more inclusive, right? And you can list those things, and they're quite easy to action because they're quite practical, and you can put it on a on a sheet ahead of a field trip, or you can have it as part of your lab code of conduct if you run a lab or something. I think some of the other things are more cultural, and they're more to do with language and awareness. So, and they're quite small things, right? So, ableist language, right, is quite rife, and stopping yourself using ableist language because it's rooted in your everyday language is quite hard. You can write down for people, don't use ableist language in a guide, right, or something. But at that moment when you're talking, it's quite a struggle, isn't it, to kind of stop yourself from using language that's very ingrained in you. So I think some of it is just effort. I think it's making people aware that there are actions and language which makes spaces hostile to people, and for them to stop doing those things. And like I said, I think some of it's very practical, but some of it is equally just a bit more, not philosophical, but it's certainly more cultural, and cultural change is much harder than practical change, right? You know, you can write down a series of protocols for something and people have to follow it. But behaviour change is really hard. So, and I'll say it as well, I think having difficult conversations and tackling people about behaviours is really important for those of you who are in positions of security and privilege, who feel able to tackle problematic language and behaviour. You know, my experience recently at the University of Manchester was an example of where senior people did not do that, and that had a really bad effect on me and other people. So I'd say that their things to do is to try and create an atmosphere in which those difficult conversations can happen. And I think as well, the one thing I would say as well is making it clear to people that science spaces include this sort of stuff. So science spaces aren't simply for good science. Conferences, colloquiums, symposium sessions, whatever it is, they are also for conversations about things that attract and retain people within science. The one amazing white guy who wins all the prizes at EGU and blah, 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 you know, people say, well, he was a terrible person because he sexually harassed all the people for 40 years, but it doesn't matter because he gave us this equation. For me, that's not good enough, because think about all of the talent that has been lost from geosciences that could have produced 2 equations, right? So I think we need to be really quite demanding of our scientists as we train them. And we need to be really demanding about the standards that we hold people to and what we view a scientist as being. Thank you.